Join us by the fireside for our evening tales of true life's strange experiences with things that lie beyond the veil of the known and into the misty depths of the mysterious and unknown. An electrician in the basement. I'm an electrician and I had a traumatic experience. It was a pretty terrifying paranormal thing that happened back in 2010 when I was working as an electrician. To this day, I still get goosebumps and anxiety, even just thinking back to that day. It happened on a Wednesday. I was called out by a customer to rewire the old electric wiring in a basement of an old house. I drove out in the afternoon. It was a sunny day in summer, and I was called out of town to a very rural, small town area. I arrived at the address in my work van. There was this very long gravel driveway that was kind of unkempt and overgrown on the sides with bushes and trees, and this would lead up to the house. After driving along it for what seemed like forever, I began to wonder where the heck I was going. I got this eerie dread sort of feeling for some reason, like I was somehow cut off from the known world or some kind of weird feeling like that. And it was like I was entering into another realm or another time or something. It was just really bizarre. I don't know how to describe it except to say it was just really strange and scary kind of thing. Anyway, eventually I arrived at a clearing that was also overgrown with weeds and, trees and bushes. And I kid you not, at that point, my heart just skipped a beat as I suddenly found myself slowly driving up to a very old house that was just like something out of a classic horror movie, like kind of a Stephen King movie or something, story. It was a huge house and it was made of gray stone or something like that, with tall windows and turrets even. I guess it was more of a mansion really than a house. I don't know how many rooms it had, but there were probably at least 15, if not more. The house was on 4 levels, which included the basement I was scheduled to work in for the next few hours, probably. The house looked almost abandoned, and I began to wonder if I should just leave and just come up with some kind of excuse and call my boss to let him know that nobody was home so that I could just go and just hightail it out of there because by that point, to be honest, I had a really bad feeling about this place. And the last thing I wanted to do was walk inside the house, let alone a creepy, musty old basement. Anyways, I convinced myself I was just letting my imagination get to me, and I stopped the van outside the front of the house, and I got out to knock on the door or ring the bell. I wasn't sure if there was a bell. I couldn't see it at that point. But as I walked up to the door, oddly, just like in the movies actually, there was this old brass kind of lion's head or ram or whatever knocker on the front door. So I thought, okay, weird, but I'll go for it. And I knocked loudly 3 times. I half expected to see an ancient old English butler answer the door or something, and I suddenly got a really creepy feeling and almost lost my nerve. But just as I really was starting to decide whether I should just nope the hell out of there, the door opened with a loud creak and sort of rattle, and an ancient-looking woman with a sort of hunched back stood looking up at me. Her hair was long and white and tied back, and she wore this old-fashioned kind of clothes, probably from the 30s or 40s or something. Her eyes were gray and had a sharpness about them that struck me as well. I introduced myself, and she said she was Mrs. Nelson and that she was the owner of the house. She seemed friendly enough, which put me a little at ease, but I couldn't help feeling that something about the place, and even her, was just a bit off. But then, this is New England, and there are a lot of old houses and just strange characters, so I told myself. The inside of the house, a sort of massive entryway, was as impressive and ancient as the outside, and also quite dingy and dark. I wondered if she lived alone, and if so, how could she care for such a massive place all alone? I didn't want to be rude and start asking questions, so I just grabbed my stuff and followed her towards the basement, down a long, dark corridor. At this point, I started to get that feeling of apprehension again, and the idea of going down into a basement that was likely to be even more dark and ominous than the rest of the house was really starting to concern me. But I told myself I was being irrational, that I was letting my imagination run away with me, etc. She led me to a door just outside the massive kitchen area, and she stopped in front of it, looked up at me and smiled, and she opened the door and said cheerfully, "Here it is." I found myself looking down into what seemed like a dark abyss. The steps were long and very vertical, not to mention they were extremely narrow and made for smaller feet, so that larger, modern people had to go down sideways, holding on to the rather fragile old wooden railing. I wondered how I'd get my electrical equipment down there. Likely I'd have to make 2 or 3 trips, which was pretty daunting to think about. I couldn't fathom how this tiny old woman could even use these steps, and I wondered if there was some other entrance from outside which would make sense. If so, why did she want me to use the stairs? Surely an outside entrance would be easier than going through the house. Well, I figured she was probably just eccentric with the usual odd behavior of elderly oddballs, so I didn't ask why. She explained that she didn't go down there anymore because of her knees, and then gave me directions on where to find the circuit breaker, wiring, etc. Turns out I'd have to find a room down there where it was located. So I turned on the dingy light switch at the top of the stairs and started the long descent with my work lights and tools and stuff that I needed. Once I started shuffling down the stairs, she closed the door up above, which I thought kind of odd, but oh well. At this point, I felt rather nervous, and I was suddenly hit with a strong musty smell. And I noticed the sudden drop in temperature too. But then it was a basement, so maybe this was normal. I wasn't really sure. I kept going, however, until I reached the bottom. Once there, I was shocked to see that the basement was massive, and it was, of course, completely unfinished. Like in the old days, with just a stone floor and walls and granite by the looks of it, and it was damp. There were wooden shelves along the walls, and they were crammed full of stuff, including a large collection of old dolls in moldy clothes. To the right of the steps, on one wall, I could see a door, and I reluctantly walked over towards it, in the dim, dingy light of a single light bulb hanging from the center of the large space. I put my stuff down by the door where she had indicated that I'd find the circuit breaker, and the first thing I intended to do was flood the place with light by turning on my work lights, which I'd made sure were well charged before going there. For some reason, I was now extremely nervous, and I had noticed that my heart had actually started to beat faster the moment I stepped onto the basement floor. I held out my hand, fingers kind of spread out, just to check and see if my hand was steady. But I was quite startled to see that my fingers were actually shaking. It was like my body was screaming, "Danger! Danger!" But my mind kept rationalizing that it was all in my head and to get a grip because I was just overreacting due to the house being old and the basement creepy as hell. I ignored my fight or flight signals that my body was giving out, and I reached down to my bag to pull out the lights and tools that I'd need. Suddenly, I heard an unmistakable sound of shuffling. It was like something was moving about inside the room with the door closed. It sounded large, but I told myself and figured that it was probably just rats or feral cats or some other, large animal that had gotten in somehow through a hole somewhere. So I, again, nervously just sort of, fumbled about and took out my work lights, and I turned the switch to turn them on. Nothing happened. The lights didn't go on. I played around with the switch a little bit longer, but, it just would not turn on, which was really strange because I had done this so many times. I always used my lights, and, I always made sure that they were charged before I went to work. So, great, I thought. How the crap am I going to be able to work now with only the dim basement lights to illuminate the place? I figured there'd likely be a light inside the room, but even if there was, I'd have to turn off the electricity to that whole area before I started working anyway. So how would I see to work? Well, I figured I'd at least find the light in there and take a look at things first, and then see if I could work using a flashlight and perhaps my phone too, at least, to get something done until I could charge the work lights. I looked at the closed old wooden door with the latch, and I suddenly felt this sense of dread again at the idea of opening it all the way. So I thought I'd open it just a bit and reach round the wall with my hand to see if there was indeed a light switch there, which, I figured there would be because, there usually is a light switch right by a door. So I turned up the latch and I nervously slipped my left hand in to feel the wall on the right side of the door on the inside for a switch. Relieved, I actually found it. It felt like one of those rounded, old-style switches, and I flipped the switch up. It flickered suddenly with a light, but then just died and went out, to my dismay. I was about to flip it up and down again, just to, see if I could get it to work, when suddenly something happened that made my heart beat so hard against my chest that I felt I'd pass out. I actually felt a sudden nausea come over me in that moment. Something cold and wet was touching my hand, grasping it from above, holding it down on the light switch as though to stop me from moving it. The thing, hand or whatever it was, felt like this bloody, wet, sort of cold meat kind of sensation. That's the best way I can describe it. But what came next was so terrifying it scarred me for life. A sudden stench of rotting flesh came from the crack in the open door and hit me like a breath from the dead. At the same time, or perhaps it was after, I don't know anymore, this terrifying demonic growl just came from whatever was behind that door. It was then I just lost it, and I let out an involuntary scream, and I pulled my hand the hell out of the door, slammed it shut, and let the latch down, and I just grabbed my stuff, feeling like I was about to faint, and I ran towards the stairs. Something shifted as a sense of extreme fear came over me, and somehow it distorted my senses, and I became suddenly like I couldn't make out the stairs anymore. My perception was somehow altered in a weird way, and the basement light was now flickering and had grown dimmer even. I wasn't a religious man, but at that moment I knew I was about to die or lose my sanity or both. I don't know. So I just started saying the Lord's Prayer in my head. I couldn't say it out loud because I had lost my ability to speak or even cry out because I was so terrified. I just couldn't seem to make a sound. All I remember then, after praying, was that I fell down and just passed out. I woke up to the sounds of birds singing and warm sun on my face. I have no idea how long I was there for. Puzzled, I looked around me and I saw my van, and my bag and toolboxes were just lying close by. My phone lay next to me, and I picked it up and looked at the time. It was 4:30 p.m. I remembered everything that had happened, but as I looked around, I couldn't see a house anywhere. In fact, all I saw was a long dirt road, woods on either side, and I was next to a large clearing with some old stone walls that were in ruin or something, and so that you could only see some parts of what had once been the foundation to a large building. I didn't want to hang around there anymore to try to get answers to what the hell had happened to me. But I had somehow been there for about 3 hours. And I don't know how that time passed even. I just grabbed my stuff at that point. I threw it all into the van and I just tore out of there as fast as I could. Fortunately, the van worked and I just drove out of there. I don't know what happened to me that day, and everything is still so strangely clear to me. And to be honest, I wish it wasn't. I feel like even though it's been so many years since that happened, I'm still haunted by the memory of it. And I don't know why. I've been to therapy, but it doesn't help. I've never taken drugs, but for a while after the incident, I wondered if I'd had some kind of a breakdown which caused me to hallucinate that time. So I decided, about 6 months after the incident, to try to get some information on that area. I guess just to prove to myself, you know, if this really had been real or if it had been some kind of hallucination. And I wanted to find out about those ruins I had found myself in that day after the traumatic incident. So I went to the local library and archives, but for some reason, there was no information about it. I almost gave up at that point, but then around that time, I decided one day to go to an old local bar, and I got to meet some of the old-timer locals, and since it was a small town, after a few drinks, I got up the courage to ask about that area, its history, etc. But I never mentioned my experience for fear of being ridiculed. So one old guy then told me that back in the 1920s, a family had owned a large mansion in that exact spot where the ruined foundations now lay. One day, nobody knows what happened exactly, but the family, which was husband, wife, and 2 kids, and then there was another kid. But anyway, the husband, wife, and 2 of the kids just up and disappeared one day. Nobody knows where they went. There was never any trace of them, and they were never found. The only family member that was found alone in the house was the 16-year-old mentally and physically retarded son who was found locked up in a room in the basement. Later, his grandmother apparently moved into the house and she took care of him. So there was only herself and him, and there was one servant who lived in the house apparently, and nothing much more is known about them, except that at one time there was a fire that destroyed the mansion and killed the 3 inhabitants. I just sat speechless, listening to the old man as he told me the awful story. My legs felt shaky after that, and I just walked out of there as I recall that horrible day when I had opened the door down in the basement and felt that cold meat hand on mine, and the stench and terrifying, tormented growl. I wondered if I went back and had a better look at the ruins, whether I'd find the area of the basement. But I don't have the nerve to ever go back there, for fear I might lose my sanity if I was to drive in there and see the house as it was when I first arrived, just like it had been in the 1920s. The handprint. I used to work as a CNA in an assisted living facility. First year working with a patient privately, and there were no issues. Nothing weird happened. Then I get asked to work overnights, and at first, it was all good. It was okay. I tried to nap throughout the night as much as I could, but a couple of months in, I kept waking up in the middle of my naps. It was like being startled into wakefulness. Then I started to wake up to what felt like someone whispering my name in my ear. Okay, that was pretty creepy, but maybe it was just a dream. I wasn't sure. Then, a week later, I woke up to a voice that was kind of neutral. It was not exactly either male or female. It was just a voice violently shouting my name. It was like it echoed across the room when I was fully awakened. But I thought, well, maybe it was still a dream. I don't know. I tried my best to rationalize it. But right after this, my patient started seeing things, of course. Talking to people that aren't there, accusing me of drugging her, and she was seeing strange men in the window and people hiding in her closets. She was terrified. I suspected she had a UTI, but apparently she just had pneumonia and was hospitalized for a few days. The worst thing, though, after all this happened, every day at 5:45 p.m., my patient scoots on down to the dining hall for dinner, and I get an hour's break. So one day, it was in mid-January, I believe, last year, I wanted to take a shower because, I did a lot of cleaning that day, and I just felt a little bit kind of grimy and dirty. So I took a long shower, the kind that fogs up all the windows. I exit the bathroom, dressed and dried, and for some reason, the first thing my eyes got drawn to are the window near my patient's bed. There's a handprint in the upper right corner, clearly outlined. Now, not only had the door to the suite been locked, but my patient is really tiny and short, and she's immobile without her scooter due to paralyzation caused by polio. Not to mention, she has 5 fingers and the handprint only had 4. Unadulterated, absolute anxiety just set in when you are faced with physical truth, and that handprint will forever haunt my memory, taunting the logical, cynical side of me. Now, I'm not a religious woman, but I'd have prayed the rosary at that moment if I could find one. My patient moved and no longer sees people in her windows and closets. It turns out she doesn't have dementia either, after all. And I no longer get that terrifying, hair raising feeling that something malicious is following me home from work at night. So it was something in that particular area and that room, and I will never forget the terror that I felt there.